For over 30 years, he walked into people's lives and said something no one else was saying. You are worth saving. Then, in 2014, no warning, no farewell, he closed the door. For 10 years, the man who built a career on being seen chose to be invisible. On July 13, 2024, the day after his 76th birthday, Richard Simmons was found dead, alone, inside the same house he had never left. What followed wasn't just grief, it was a reckoning. How did a humiliated kid from New Orleans become the most compassionate voice in America? And why did the man who never let anyone face their darkest moments alone face his own without letting anyone in? Before we answer that, we need to go back to the beginning. Richard Simmons entered the world on July 12, 1948, in New Orleans, Louisiana, a city built on excess, music, and the particular American art of performing joy even through suffering. He was born Milton Teagle Simmons, the second son of Leonard and Shirley Simmons. His father was a part-time entertainer and jack of all trades. His mother, a former burlesque dancer who had reinvented herself into respectability. Together, they built a household that ran on charm, performance, and the unspoken rule that personality could compensate for almost anything. From the earliest age, Richard understood that rule completely. He was not the athletic child, not the handsome one, not the one teachers pointed to as a future success. He was the loud one, the funny one, the one who walked into a room and immediately began performing, because stillness, for Richard, felt dangerously close to invisibility. But behind the performance, there was a war already underway. By his early teens, Richard had developed a complicated and painful relationship with food and with his own body. He ate compulsively, not out of hunger, but out of something harder to name. Loneliness disguised as appetite. Anxiety swallowed one bite at a time. By the time he reached his late teens, he weighed close to 268 pounds, and the gap between the boy who performed joy and the boy who felt none had become a canyon. School was not sanctuary. It was a daily referendum on his worth, and the verdict was rarely kind. He was mocked for his weight, for his flamboyance, for the extravagance of his personality in spaces that demanded conformity. He later recalled with the kind of honesty that costs something, "I was the fat kid. I was the different kid. And different back then was not celebrated." He left New Orleans to study art in Florence, Italy, an escape as much as an education. And it was there, in Europe, that the crisis deepened before it broke open. His weight climbed further. His sense of self fractured. And one morning, he found a note tucked under the windshield wiper of a car near his apartment. A note from a stranger. It said, simply, "Fat people die young. Please don't die." He never learned who wrote it, but he kept it for the rest of his life. That anonymous message became the hinge on which everything turned. Richard Simmons returned to America not yet transformed, but pointed, the way a compass finds north before the journey even begins. The boy from New Orleans, ridiculous and radiant and quietly desperate, was about to discover that the wound he had spent his whole life hiding was exactly the wound that would make him unforgettable. He did not arrive in fitness. He crashed into it. After returning from Europe, Richard Simmons settled in Los Angeles, a city that worshipped physical perfection with the devotion of a religion and punished its absence with equal fervor. For a man still carrying the weight of his adolescence, both literally and emotionally, it was perhaps the cruelest possible environment, and perhaps the most necessary one. The turning point came not in a gym, but in a restaurant. Simmons had taken a job as a waiter at Derek's, an upscale Italian eatery in Beverly Hills, where the clientele was wealthy, polished, and entirely indifferent to the round young man refilling their water glasses. It was there, surrounded by abundance he could not consume without consequence, that something finally cracked open. He began, slowly and painfully, to lose weight. Not through a program or a plan, but through sheer will and the dawning understanding that his body was not his enemy. It was the only home he had ever truly owned. By the mid-1970s, he had lost over 100 pounds. And instead of moving quietly into a smaller life, Richard Simmons did the only thing that had ever made sense to him. He turned the experience into a performance, into a mission. In 1974, he opened Simmons, his own exercise studio on Beverly Drive in Los Angeles. It was unlike anything the fitness world had ever seen. There were no mirrors designed to humiliate, no atmosphere of exclusion, no cult of the already beautiful pretending to welcome the rest. Simmons was built for the people the fitness industry had always ignored: the overweight, the elderly, the ones who had tried everything and failed, the ones who had stopped trying entirely. Richard greeted every single person who walked through that door by name, not as a policy, as a conviction. He understood, with a precision that no business school could have taught him, that the greatest barrier between an unhealthy person and a healthy life was not information. It was not access. It was the belief, lodged deep and hard as bone, that they did not deserve to be helped. Richard Simmons made it his life's work to dismantle that belief one person at a time. Television found him, or rather, he found television, in the late 1970s, with appearances that immediately distinguished him from every other fitness personality of the era. Where others were polished and prescriptive, Richard was chaotic and tender. He wept on camera. He hugged strangers. He wore outfits that defied description and delivered encouragement that defied cynicism. By 1980, he had his own television show. By 1982, Sweatin to the Oldies had become one of the best-selling fitness videos in American history. A phenomenon not because of its exercise content, but because of its emotional content. The people in those videos were not models. They were real bodies, real faces, real effort. And Richard danced among them like a man who had found his exact purpose on Earth. The 1980s and 1990s were a sustained eruption of presence. Talk show appearances, infomercials, his Deal-A-Meal weight loss program, his Project Hope initiative that brought free fitness classes to underprivileged communities. He testified before Congress in 1990, advocating for mandatory physical education in public schools, and reportedly moved several legislators to tears in the process. He called his followers his people, and he meant it without irony. Letters arrived by the thousands, from women who had lost 100 pounds and credited Richard as the only voice that had ever made them feel capable, from men who had never exercised in their lives and began because Richard had somehow made them feel that their effort mattered. From teenagers, from retirees, from people in hospitals and people in prisons, and people in the quiet desperation of ordinary life. He answered as many as he could, personally, by hand. At his peak, Richard Simmons was not simply famous. He was necessary. A figure who had taken the most private of human struggles, the shame of a body that felt wrong, the grief of a life unlived, and dragged it into the light with sequins and tears and a sincerity so complete it was almost impossible to look away from. The boy who had once been handed a note about dying young had become the man telling millions of others that they were worth saving. And for a long time, he believed it applied to himself as well. no one saw it coming. That is what made it so devastating. In early 2014, Richard Simmons simply stopped. No announcement, no farewell tour, no final episode, no goodbye letter to the millions who had built their lives around his voice. One day, he was there, laughing, weeping, rhinestones catching the light. And then he was not. The door of his Hollywood Hills mansion, a house he had owned for decades, nestled in the hills above a city that had made him famous, closed quietly behind him, and it did not open again. At first, the world assumed it was temporary. A vacation, perhaps. A health matter that would resolve itself in weeks. Richard had always bounced back. Resilience was practically his brand. His fans waited with the particular patience of people who loved someone unconditionally, certain that the silence was just a pause before the next explosion of joy. But weeks became months, months became years, and the silence deepened into something that no longer felt like rest. The origin of the withdrawal, as details would later confirm, was physical. In 2013, Richard had undergone knee surgery, a procedure common enough, unremarkable by most medical standards. But for a man whose entire identity had been built on movement, on dancing, on the physical expression of joy and encouragement, the recovery was not simply painful, it was existential. He could not dance. He could not bounce across a studio floor. He could not throw his arms around a stranger and leap with the abandon that had defined him for 4 decades. And as the recovery stretched on, something else emerged. Something harder to treat than a damaged knee. The surgery had changed his body in ways that Richard found increasingly difficult to accept. Weight returned. The physical transformation that had once represented his greatest triumph, the 100 pounds lost, the body reclaimed, the proof that change was possible, began to reverse. And for a man who had spent his entire adult life as a symbol of that transformation, the reversal felt not like a medical setback. It felt like a personal annihilation. Those close to him in those early months of withdrawal described a man who was not simply recovering. He was hiding. He stopped answering calls. He canceled appearances. He retreated from Simmons, the studio he had opened 40 years earlier, the room where thousands of people had found themselves in his presence. In March 2014, without ceremony, Simmons closed its doors permanently. The place that had been his temple, his purpose, his daily proof that he mattered, was gone. What followed was a decade that the public could only partially reconstruct, because Richard allowed almost no one inside. His primary companion during those years was his housekeeper, Teresa Reveles, a woman who had worked for him for decades and who became, by most accounts, the singular human presence in his daily life. She cooked for him. She managed the house. She filtered the outside world down to a manageable silence. Friends who had known Richard for years found themselves unable to reach him. Former colleagues, television personalities who had shared stages with him, fitness professionals who considered him a mentor, all reported the same experience. Calls unreturned. Visits deflected. A wall, invisible but absolute, erected between Richard Simmons and everyone who had ever loved him. His longtime manager, Michael Catalano, eventually parted ways with him. The severance was quiet, unexplained, and deeply unsettling to those who had always seen Catalano as one of Richard's most anchoring relationships. In 2017, a podcast called Missing Richard Simmons spent 6 episodes attempting to understand where he had gone and why. It became one of the most downloaded podcasts in America that year, a measure not of voyeurism, but of genuine collective grief. Millions of people who had never met Richard Simmons felt his absence as a personal loss. They had grown up with him. They had cried with him. They had lost weight with him in their living rooms on Tuesday mornings. And now he was simply gone. Alive, but unreachable. Present, but invisible. The LAPD conducted a welfare check in 2016, responding to public concern. Officers spoke with Richard directly. He was alive, they confirmed. He was home. He was, by his own account, fine. Fine. It was a word that landed with the hollow weight of things left unsaid, because the details that would surface after his death painted a portrait of a man who was many things during those 10 years. But fine was not among them. He was struggling with his weight in ways that caused him profound shame. He was dealing with a knee that never fully healed, that limited his mobility and reminded him daily of the life he had been forced to abandon. He was navigating a loneliness so complete that even those who loved him most were not permitted close enough to witness it. The man who had spent 30 years telling others they were worth saving had, somewhere in the silence of that house, stopped believing it applied to him. And perhaps that is the most heartbreaking detail of all. Not the isolation itself, but the reason behind it. Richard Simmons did not disappear because he stopped caring about the world. He disappeared because he could no longer bear for the world to see him as he was. The rhinestones required a certain version of himself, a version he no longer recognized in the mirror. And so he stayed inside, in the house on the hill, with the door closed and the curtains drawn, waiting perhaps for a version of himself that never came back. On the morning of July 13th, 2024, the day after Richard Simmons turned 76, his housekeeper, Teresa Reveles, found him unresponsive in his bedroom. Emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but there was nothing to be done. Richard Simmons was pronounced dead at the scene. No struggle, no hospital, no final public moment. Just the quiet of a house that had been quiet for 10 years, and a man who had slipped away inside it. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner would later determine the cause of death as heart disease, a finding that was medically precise and emotionally insufficient. Because a heart can fail for reasons that no autopsy fully captures, the weight of isolation, the slow erosion of purpose, the particular damage done by a decade of believing yourself unworthy of being seen. He was 76 years old. He died the day after his birthday, alone. The tributes came immediately and overwhelmingly, from celebrities who had known him personally, from fitness professionals who credited him as the reason they had entered the industry, from ordinary Americans, tens of thousands of them, who flooded social media with memories so specific and so tender that they read less like fan posts and more like eulogies from people who had lost a family member. He called me by name at a book signing in 1997, and I never forgot it. I lost 60 pounds with Sweatin to the Oldies after my divorce. Richard saved my life. He sent me a handwritten note when I wrote to him in 1989. I still have it. The volume and the specificity of the grief revealed something important. Richard Simmons had not simply been famous. He had been personal. He had created, across 30 years of relentless presence, thousands upon thousands of individual relationships with people who had never met him, but who felt with complete conviction that he had seen them. That is an extraordinarily rare thing, and its absence, when it finally registered, was felt like a physical loss. But alongside the tributes, details began to surface, quietly at first, then with increasing weight. Former friends and colleagues spoke carefully, choosing words that honored Richard while acknowledging truths that the decade of silence had obscured. A picture emerged, not of a man destroyed, but of a man profoundly and unnecessarily alone in his final years. The knee surgery had never fully resolved. Chronic pain had become a constant companion, limiting his movement and reinforcing the withdrawal that began in 2014. Those who had managed to speak with him in his final years described a man still warm, still funny, still capable of the sudden emotional generosity that had always defined him, but diminished, quieter, carrying something heavy that he refused to put down. The physical transformation he had feared had continued during the years of isolation. He had gained significant weight, the cruel irony of a man whose entire legacy was built on the possibility of physical change, finding himself unable, in private, to apply that possibility to himself. It was not hypocrisy. It was the particular tragedy of someone who could see the path clearly for everyone else, and could not find it in the dark for himself. His relationship with Teresa Reveles remained the central human thread of his final decade. She was devoted to him. She protected his privacy with a loyalty that some of his former friends found frustrating, and others found quietly heartbreaking. A reminder that even in isolation, Richard had inspired fierce love in those closest to him. In the weeks following his death, his brother Lenny Simmons spoke publicly, with a grief that was raw and unfiltered. He described attempting, repeatedly and unsuccessfully, to maintain contact during the years of withdrawal. Phone calls that went unanswered, visits that were gently but firmly deflected. A brother who was present in memory and absent in reality. Lenny's words carried no anger, only the specific sorrow of someone who had loved a person they could not reach. "I just wanted him to know he wasn't alone," Lenny said. "I don't know if he ever really believed that." That sentence arrived like a verdict, because Richard Simmons had spent his entire public life ensuring that other people never felt alone. He had driven across cities to visit fans in hospitals. He had stayed on the phone for hours with strangers in crisis. He had built an entire career on the radical and unfashionable belief that no one should have to face their hardest moments without someone beside them. And in the end, he had faced his own hardest decade without allowing anyone beside him. The details that surfaced after his death did not diminish him. They completed him. They revealed not a fallen icon, but a deeply human one. A man whose greatest strength and greatest vulnerability were the same thing. He gave everything he had to other people, and when the time came to receive that same gift, he did not know how to let it in. The door that had closed in 2014 had not been locked against the world. It had been locked against himself. There is a particular kind of legacy that cannot be measured in sales figures or television ratings or the number of times a name trended on a given day. It lives instead in the specific, unheroic, deeply private moments that no camera ever captured. The woman who laced up her sneakers for the first time in 15 years because a man in rhinestone shorts looked her in the eye and told her she could. The teenager who wrote a letter to a stranger and received one back, handwritten, that said simply, "I am proud of you." The person sitting alone in a hospital room who pressed play on a VHS tape and felt, for the first time in months, that the world contained someone who genuinely wished them well. That is where Richard Simmons actually lived. Not on the talk show couch, not in the infomercial. In those moments, millions of them, accumulated over 30 years, scattered across the country in the hearts of people who never made the news and never needed to. What the details that surfaced after his death revealed was not a scandal. There was no betrayal, no hidden cruelty, no secret that recast his legacy in a darker light. What they revealed was a man undone by the very sensitivity that had made him extraordinary. Richard Simmons felt everything. That was his gift, and his wound in equal measure. He felt the shame of the people who came to him broken, and he absorbed it and transformed it into encouragement. He felt the loneliness of the forgotten, and he made it his mission. But when his own body began to change, when the mirror reflected something he had spent his entire adult life moving away from, he felt that too, with the full, unfiltered intensity of a man who had never learned to be gentle with himself the way he had always been gentle with others. The cruelest irony of Richard Simmons's final decade is not that he suffered. It is that he suffered alone, by choice, when an entire country would have held him without condition. He had earned that. He had built it, person by person, year by year. The love was there. It was always there. He simply could not open the door to let it in. And yet, what he left behind is not diminished by how he left. The 20 million workout videos still exist. The congressional testimony still exists. The handwritten letters, kept in drawers and shoeboxes and frames across America, still exist. Simmons is gone, but the people it changed are not. Richard Simmons spent his life arguing that every person, regardless of size or age or history, deserved to be seen, deserved to be celebrated, deserved to take up space in the world without apology. He was right. He was always right. He was simply never quite able to apply that argument to himself. And perhaps that is the lesson his story leaves us. Not as a warning, but as an invitation to extend to ourselves, even once, even imperfectly, the same grace we so readily offer to others. To believe, with the same conviction Richard brought to every stranger he ever met, that we too are worth saving. He spent a lifetime making sure you knew that. It is only right that we remember it for him. If Richard Simmons ever made you feel seen, share this video. Subscribe for more untold stories of the people who shaped our world. And in the comments, tell us, what did Richard Simmons mean to you? Because today, the stage belongs to him one last time, and he deserves every word.